So a while back I did a video on reusable canning lids and it kind of went viral, so much so that the company was sold out of lids for quite a long while. But it's been a bit since that video and a lot of you have been asking me, do I still like those reusable lids? So in today's video, I'm going to give you my thoughts. Works out good because I have some beets ready in the greenhouse, and so we're going to do a little bit of canning this morning. So I have 2 crops of beets this year, one in my outdoor garden, and we planted these here in the greenhouse earlier this spring, and they're kind of beyond the point they need to be dealt with, so that's our project today. So the verdict is in. After using these lids for a while now, I still love them. And I think they are a fantastic option, especially for right now, since we live in a time of weird shortages and supply chain issues, and you really never know what's gonna happen next. So I love having these in my pantry and knowing that no matter what happens, and if canning lids aren't available, I can still do canning and food preservation. However, there are a couple caveats that I wanted to share with you today in this update video, so you kind of know what to expect and just some things I've observed over the months of using these. So one thing I've noticed is that there is a slightly higher rate of failure with these lids, but I don't think it's necessarily the lid's fault. I think it's more to do with the fact that you have to use them differently. So if you've been canning for a long time like I have, it just takes a little bit of practice to get these right. And when I do see the lids not sealing, I'm suspecting that it's probably me not tightening properly, which I'm going to show you more about that in just a minute. I also did have one jar become unsealed down in my pantry. It was actually a jar of water that I had canned as an experiment, so it wasn't a big deal. But I went down, I don't know, 6 months after I had canned it, and I tested the seals, and it just came off. So if that had been a jar of food, I would have thrown that food away because it didn't know how long it had been open. That still happens sometimes with regular metal lids, so that's not a deal breaker for me, but it did happen, so I wanted to tell you about it. So I came across an interesting study by the National Center for Home Food Preservation, which is one of the kind of governing authorities that tests canning recipes. And they actually did a really extensive test comparing these lids to the metal ones, and they found that they worked the same. They didn't come across any differences as far as these sealed worse or the other ones sealed better. They were all pretty similar across the board. So like I said, I really think that when they do fail, it's probably user error, but there are some ways you can easily work through that. So if you're using these lids for the first time, I would recommend starting with water, just so you get the hang of it and you don't waste any food. Now, if you're super adventurous, go ahead and try it with food for the first time. I will say there's a couple different types of foods that may cause you a little more trouble as you're learning to use the lids. The first one would be foods that have like some gas in them, like beans. If you're canning beans in your pressure canner, these might be a little trickier for you. They're not impossible to use, just a little more difficult. And then the other factor is really thick foods like tomato sauce or applesauce. Sometimes that can cause a little bit more sealing issue. But again, I use these for tomato sauce and applesauce, and it has still worked. Today I'm just doing these pickled beets with a vinegar water brine, so I'm not worried about this causing any issues with the lids. It should be good to go. So I can use my water bath canner to do these beets because I'm turning them into pickled beets, and the extra acid from my vinegar makes it safe for the water bath. I'm also using an apple cider vinegar here just to provide a little extra sweetness so I don't have to use as much sugar, because my good old Ball Blue Book calls for 2 cups of white sugar for just like 6 pints. That's a lot. So I'm going to be using honey as my sweetener and apple cider vinegar, and then cinnamon stick for simmering and some allspice. With these sort of recipes, the safety component, as far as making sure the food is not going to get botulism in it, is going to be coming from the acid in your vinegar, not the sugar or the spices. So you have some wiggle room here to play with different sweeteners, less sweetener, different sorts of ground up spices, dry spices. So the sky's the limit here as long as you have your vinegar dialed in and you're using a recommended amount. So for this recipe, it's recommended that I leave about a 1/4 inch of room at the top, but I'm gonna go a little bit more than that, at least a 1/2 inch, maybe up to 1 inch. And especially if you're canning something that's really thick, like applesauce, definitely leave more space. So it's kind of hard to see on the video, but some of these are a little bit more than 1 inch, so I'm going to fill them up a little bit more. I usually think of 1 inch going to the bottom of this rim line. So as long as I'm right there or a little bit above, I'm going to call it good for this go round. So in case you missed my other video about these lids, which you can go back and watch that, we'll link that down below, but they are 2 pieces and you're still going to need your metal ring to go with them. So these have a plastic top part and then a rubber gasket, and then we're going to affix these to the jars and screw them down just like you would a normal lid. Couple little notes here. This gasket, you can put it on as is right now, but sometimes it's a little bit easier if you heat it up in hot water first. You don't want to boil it, but you just want to put it in some hot water to make it a little bit more pliable. So now I'm just going to make extra sure my rims are clean, which I always do when I can, but it's even more important with these lids. Just to make sure there's nothing blocking the seal. Now comes the moment of truth. We're going to put on our lids, and this is where we have to be a little extra careful. So I'm going to put my seals on. They've been sitting in my hot water. And I'm going to try really hard to keep them centered on the rim to the best of my ability. Okay, and I'm going to add the plastic part. Sets right in there. Okay, now I can't stress this part enough because I think this is what's tripping up a lot of people, and I think when I've had sealing issues, this is what was causing it. You cannot tighten these down right now the same way you would tighten down a metal lid. So normally, if you've watched my other canning videos or you have my canning course, I tell you to tighten these down until they're finger tight. That is not what you want to do with these reusable lids. We're going to go much looser than that. And that's because with the way these are designed, if too much pressure builds up, it'll prevent the jar from sealing. So we're going to leave room for that pressure to escape, and then when we pull the jars out of the canner at the end, we're going to tighten them down the rest of the way. It's very different than the metal lid, so if you're used to those, this will feel weird, but trust me, this is the way you want to do it. So normally I would twist my lids on with my metal jars till I could move it around. That's what I call finger tight. I'm going to do that, but then I'm going to unscrew it just a little bit to leave a little more wiggle room. So that's in the center. So there's finger tight, there's less than finger tight. Kind of unscrewing it just a 1/4 turn. Finger tight, less than finger tight. Okay. Feels weird, I know, but I want them just about like that. All right, now we're gonna stick them in our canner. So they are in my canning pot. The heat is on. I'm going to wait for it to come to a boil, and then I'm going to start my timer and let these process for 30 minutes and add a little bit more time if you're high altitude. So I'll go a little bit longer than 30 minutes because we're pretty high here. And then we'll do the next step when they come out. I do have a coupon code for you guys if you want to give these lids a try and add them to your canning stash. Go to theprairiehomestead.com/canninglids and use the code HOMESTEAD to save 15% on your order. You can get these in like a sample quantity, or you can get them in large quantity. Last time I shared this code, you guys broke the website and they were sold out for months, but I think they're prepared this time. So head on over theprairiehomestead.com/canninglids, code HOMESTEAD, and save 15%. Okay, my timer is up, so here we go. Okay, so now comes the other crucial part. I'm gonna grab my mitt. I like the kind of the silicone grippy stuff, and these are super hot, so be careful. And I'm going to tighten down these bands the rest of the way. Now, you would never do this with your metal lids, only with these reusable lids. Okay, those are pretty tight, and now I'm gonna let these cool completely before I take this metal ring off and test the seal. I'll probably let these sit even longer than I normally would with my metal lids, just to make sure they completely come down to room temperature. Okay, so one other quick note about this. You'll see that all of these lids are concave, which means they're not domed. If I had one of these that was domed looking, then I would wait a little bit before I tightened the band, because when I have that doming, it means that there's a little too much pressure in that jar. And if I crank it down right now, odds are that that seal will not be secure. So since these all look pretty good, I was good to tighten them down, but watch for that doming. It's not the end of the world, but just be aware of that. So Harvest Guard says your gaskets should last for about 6 to 8 uses. The white plastic lids will last forever. But one way that you can keep track of how many times you've used the gasket is with a Sharpie. So before you put the gasket on, you can just put a little tally mark on it, just so you know how many uses it has. I'm guessing that some of these seals are going to last more than 8 times, depending on whether you're pressure canning or water bath canning and what you're canning and how you're storing them. But just for your own curiosity's sake, it might be interesting to use your Sharpie just to see how many uses you get out of them. And if/when your little gaskets do wear out, you can buy more over at the Harvest Guard website. So there you have it. Those are my thoughts. I do recommend these lids still, even after several years. I think they're a great option. They're more economical. They save you money in the long run. You don't have to put things in the trash every time you open a jar of home canned food. And they're a great bit of reassurance that no matter what the world throws at us, we'll always be ready to preserve and can our homegrown food. So give them a try and let me know what you think.